after the tensions between Earth and Mars, between the altered and unaltered humans, had calmed down a bit. Humans were still a bit apprehensive as they saw that the Cyberns had created a fleet far more dangerous than theirs. However, they took a complete deep breath and sigh of relief when they saw that Cyberns had left. They had gone just as they said they would, gone beyond the sector. The question on everyone's mind, though, is will they be successful? The answer can be summed up with the very first battle. In a sector controlled and covered completely by the Mulseem, strange ships seemed to appear. These were ships of any conceivable size in the sectors. No one from the sector knew who they were, what they were. No one knew what they wanted. Everybody was confused. They do know that they want this species under their authority. This is a new species. If this is an exploratory group, then they must be easy pickings. We must subjugate them. We must bring them to heel. We must acquire their technology. Each warlord was drooling at the thought of this, believing they would become more and more powerful if they were able to capture this species first. Each warlord began to make their own moves. First come, first serve, after all. The warlord groups moved closer to approach the fleet. They demand that the Cyberns should stand down. They should surrender. They should be willing to serve. They should surrender. They will be treated better than simple slaves if they surrender. Promises of wonderful treatment, of riches, of wealth, of different planets, telling them it's an honor to submit to them. And then, when all else fails, a threat of death. The communications from the Mulseem warlords went completely unanswered, and this put them on the edge a little bit, but they weren't too concerned. The strange fleet that they went after just continued to advance. The fleets continued to close on each other, and eventually they got within visual range, which is basically point blank in space. As they advanced, the Mulseem fleet saw tiny little blips on their sensors. They didn't give this even a second thought, as space debris is a very common occurrence, and it's nothing for their ships to simply deflect away. It is very common to hear a clang of metal every once in a while as a small piece of stone bounces off the hull. So they continue to advance. Within 0.5 visual range, the Mulseem fleet still couldn't get an answer, so they decided to target the approaching fleet. Just as they began to lock on, they lost the locks. The entire fleet that they were approaching just seemed to vanish off the screen. Panic ensues as they didn't know what the hell happened. Did they jump? Did they explode? Was there a coronal mass ejection they didn't see, scrambling the sensors? Was it a simple malfunction? They didn't know. Slaves were beaten as they were trying desperately to restart their systems, to reset them, to try and get a lock on this new group of signatures that was coming in. But nothing seemed to work for at least an hour. The Mulseem ships immediately held, awaiting orders, as once they lose command and control, they don't do anything unless they're told. You do nothing without them, or else you are in for a beating or worse. Then, across all channels, a message came in. A strange, digitized voice. It was a message in a language they didn't understand, and it simply told them this: time to find out. At that moment, massive explosions detonated inside the Mulseem fleets. The explosions were large enough to rip ships apart that were near the explosions. Outside the explosion, metal balls made of lead were launched out from it. The size of them was about the size of a human baseball as they ripped across the enemy fleet. These tore into the hulls, many times piercing clean through the ships and through critical systems. Ships caught up in the blast immediately split apart, but the debris began to reach out and crash into other ships. As other ships are perforated by all this metal being struck at them, they are suddenly pushed out sideways and begin to crash into other ships, creating an even larger domino effect and debris field. This spread the carnage and chaos around the enemy fleets. Survivors of the explosion were trying to figure out what in the hell just happened. However, they couldn't figure out what was going on. Their sensors were completely garbled even inside their own fleet. The reason for this was the reflective flak that seemed to be chucked out with the rest of the giant ball bearings when the explosions happened. Now there was a massive ball of scrambled signals coming back, something they just couldn't figure out. They couldn't make sense of. Even if they could see the friendly ships, they couldn't get a read on them at all. There was far too much interference to figure out what was going on. However, they didn't have a chance to clear anything up. The Cybran fleet moved in, firing massive energy and ballistic cannons to take precision shots. All remaining enemy ships that hadn't known what was going on had been targeted. Those that were still moving were immediately destroyed. Most of those inside their ships didn't even know what was going on until they felt their ship be tore out from around them in a matter of seconds. Never even slowing down, the Cybrans slowly make their way through the debris field towards the planet. As they do, a small group of ships stop and send out a massive amount of drones. These drones are not combat drones, per se, no. Their job is to simply reach out and collect all the data, all the intel from the ships, and as soon as they do, to wipe out or destroy their version of a hard drive. The survivors left are there to fend for themselves. The fleet is of zero consequence to the Cyberns now. They have no intel at all. They've stripped all the intel away. And who would believe a couple of slaves inside the middle of a battle? Not those in charge. Those who had survived the battle were hesitant to board the life pods as they thought they would simply be blown out, but they couldn't stay on the ships. It was a floating coffin now. So they simply got in and began to pray to whatever great maker they called. They were grateful, as the attacking fleet that seemed to tear them apart in moments seemed to care nothing about the pods. Well, there was a reason for this. The Cyberns didn't care. They would reach the ground long before those pods do. The Cyberns began to launch the next phase as soon as they cleared the enemy debris field. Massive cylinders the size of a school bus and sometimes 2 and 3 times larger were launched towards the surface. They will break through the atmosphere 37 Earth Standard Hours before the Cyberns even begin their landing sequences. The cylinders spike into the planet and then simply open up and release their payload. What those on the ground couldn't see was an invisible cloud that started to reach out across the planet. Across the entire planet, Mulsine start to feel a little dizzy as they begin to lose their equilibrium. Of course, they want to sit down for a little while, but some can't. 4 minutes after they start feeling dizzy, they are higher than the defeated fleet out there in the ether, completely losing all semblance of where they are and what they're doing. 2.5 minutes after this, they begin to lose all their bodily functions and begin to relieve themselves on themselves. They will vomit without question, sometimes trying to breathe and vomit at the same time, which of course is not exactly smart. 5 minutes later, their reproductive organs cease function. Then it causes severe pain as the internal gangrene begins. Eventually, within about 24 hours, their genitalia will begin falling off. However, within 10 minutes, roughly, of that time, 97 to 100% of the Mulsine will be dead anyway. Just like any of those who take what cannot be returned away from anyone else, they will grow from the greatest feeling they've ever had to living the rest of their short lives in agonizing pain. And that would not be the end. The Cybrans would land roughly 3 hours after this point. Inside their exosuits, they walk, connected from every part of their suit into their body all the way up to their mind. They walk, understanding every sensor, figuring out everything that's around them. They search. They try to make sure that everything is done as they walk. Through piles of bodies contorted in their last living moments of agony, they walk. Passing the multitude of eyes, confused and scared at what they're seeing, they walk. They cover the planet looking for any Mulseem survivors, and they simply walk. Across the planet, only one Mulseem is found alive. They walk up to it, and it demands the robotic bipeds to save it. They stop walking for the first time as they look at it. They walk up, raise an appendage, and blow its head into chitinous salsa as it sprays across the ground. After this, they double-checked the planet again. Then they simply got back in their ships, picked up their cylinders that they had dropped, and left. There was no words left behind. Nothing. The only knowledge that had shown that they had been there, the only evidence they had, would be the eyewitness accounts of all the species that the Mulseem had forced into slavery. Yet, again, who would believe a slave? Planet by planet, system by system, the same scenario played out. After jamming long-range communications, they would jam the sensors and initiate their version of stealth. Simultaneously, they would send out their minds under the same type of stealth field. They would then drift close enough that the direct fire weapons just cannot miss. At this point, they use the detonation of the mines to cause absolute chaos within the enemy fleet. The reflective flak, mixed in with the jamming, disrupts all the sensors from any nearby planet, colony, station, whatever else the enemy might have, as they pick off all the stragglers with precision. They infiltrate the fleet, send out their drones, and then continue to grab more intel. Once they pass through the debris field, they launch their biochemical weapons and approach while it simply does its work. They land and double-check the extermination. Once done, they simply clean up and leave. The Mulseem would show up later. They wanted to figure out why one of their worlds or one of their colonies had gone dark and what happened to their fleet. Of course, they couldn't do anything with the data. There wasn't any left for them to grab. They would then land on the planet after their investigation and fall victim to the biochemical weapon that had not dissipated yet. It would take several human years before it dissipated enough that they could walk around without some sort of protection. They would either die or become infertile as their genitalia rotted from the inside. They assumed that this disease killed all the Mulseem on the planet, and they would simply quarantine the planet, which is standard procedure no matter what species you talk to. This would allow the locals freedom to rebuild. The debris field would obviously remain as they didn't want to even touch it. Several ships, if there was a group that wanted to, could salvage them, could possibly patchwork a few ships together, and they would have their own destroyers or frigates if they wanted. But, of course, that's up to the locals. Moving systematically, yet randomly, the Cybrans joined up with even more of their kind that came out to help them. This allowed for more targets to be hit at the same time, and soon The Mulsine began to go into self-quarantine. This was, of course, out of fear. Fear of a nasty plague that was going to kill them all. This, of course, made things a bit easier. They wouldn't have to face a massive force and go muzzle to muzzle with anybody. No. Instead, they would have small forces to take care of, forces that didn't even know what was about to hit them. After investigating another fleet that had been destroyed, they found a data packet that was not exactly something they wanted to see. They found out the Mulsine believed that the humans are the cause of their plight. They looked at the spread, and it was pretty obvious that everything had come from the Sol sector. They wanted to gather a fleet of what they could to attack Sol and wipe out any type of virus this might be, whatever it was that was killing them off. However, they could only get a small contingent, as many of the fleets did not even want to go near each other. The self-quarantine and all. Basically, once they entered the Sol sector, they were even numbers with all the human combined forces of Earth and Mars together. Only a few of the Mulsine fleets returned, most of them still in relatively good shape, yet all had battle damage. However, they all said the same thing, as they did not want to go back and deal with the horrible murder monkeys that they had to face off against. During this time, the Cyberns continued their crusade, leaving the Mulsine homeworld for last. This would take time, as they would have to take down over 2,000 planets, almost 700 colonies or satellites around these planets, 156 stations that have been built up, massive stations that could easily dock half of the Cybern fleet, all cleared of the Mulsine every single time they opened up a door and the gases went in to do their work. They didn't change their tactics ever. There was no reason to. I mean, why stop when it works, right? For all their boasting, for all their bravado, for all their supposed invincibility, the Mulsine still fall against the insanity of men with nothing left to lose as they pull out all the stops in total war. Their homeworld, their capital world, fell as well. It fell just the same as the rest of them, with the general population choking to death on the outside as they screamed in agony as their insides slowly liquefied and became their outsides. Many of them taking the quick and easy way out as they would simply destroy themselves. However, those in charge decided that they were too precious, too valuable to be left on the surface. The Cyberns, once on the planet, found they didn't have much resistance at all. They simply forced their way through the doors with all the weapons they had attached to them. However, every time they opened a door, it only took a few moments before the first stage of the gas would reach down and grab their enemy, forcing them to be so dizzy that they usually fell over and eventually got higher than a freaking kite and were just not an issue anymore. They moved down this structure that was basically a monolith, and they found the Mulsine's version of a royal family. The few surviving so deep in their bunker as the rest of the planet simply fell to the Cyberns. Those inside immediately started feeling the effects once the doors were breached. Though the Mulsine tried to fight, they fight very individualistic, and they immediately were falling down by the united front of every single Cybern working together. Those that stood over the remainder of the Mulsine looked down at them as they held themselves in pain. The Mulsine looked up, and they called these creatures something that needed to be translated. The faceless monsters, the no-face monsters, something along those lines. The translation was confusing, as it depended on which type of dialect they were using. As these faceless ones looked down, the Mulsine could look up and see massive amount of information scrolling down on the front of this visor. Though they couldn't see through the visor, they could see this strange language, though they couldn't read it. They didn't know what it was, though if they realized it was backwards from what they could see, maybe they could understand. The faceless machines then walked over to each member as they did the same, simply stopping and looking, seeming to be scrolling through information. At that point, all but two were immediately shot dead, their bodies blown apart into a pile of chitin and just simple entrails. The last two were brought to the throne in full view of the subjugated species that were kept there for either protection or pleasure. The last two remaining were brought over to the throne and thrown down at it. As they started to get up, their hands were forced down, and one of these strange biped fired some sort of balled up liquid that seemed to explode and burst across each of their manipulators. Then they tried to move them and realized that this was some sort of epoxy that was holding them down, and it was drying extremely fast. With this, they were now stuck in a position where their hands were on the ground, and as they tried to bring their feet closer, their feet were then stuck to the ground as they were stuck in their position with their head down and their bulbous butt in the air. Then these bipeds turned to the other species in the room. Those were off on the side, many of them small, little, almost rodent things. Others seemed to almost be reptilian, and there seemed to be an insectoid or two in there as well. All of them seemed to be taken for their aesthetic, obviously. Yet each of them seemed to have a shine of fear on their face. They were petrified at what these bipeds would do, as they just seemed to walk in and without hesitation end so many. And now they have imprisoned those that had imprisoned them their whole lives. What are they going to do? Should they surrender? Should they bow down? Should they try to placate by pleasuring these, whatever they are, these robots that they saw? However, they didn't need to do much. As all this was going through their minds, they watched as more gas slowly entered, and those who were still there on the ground were having trouble even staying in their positions. They were dizzy as all hell. And just as this next stage, where they were starting to get high, came in, one of these bipeds spoke. It was a broken language, but it was enough that they could understand. It was mechanical, and it seemed as though whatever this machine was doing was trying to put all the species' languages together. Though coherent, it was difficult. It stated, "These two were the worst to all of you. They used their perceived authority to force you to do things that are unforgivable. Now they have no authority. Perhaps you would like a bit of retribution." The one that was speaking then motioned to the former emperor and his drugged-out son. Considering their position, some of the slaves began to think of something, and many of them began to give strange sounds, which turned out to be laughing. Before leaving, humanity left a message. In the bunker, under the capital world's mantle, while the screams of pain mixed with screams of elation were echoing behind them, they left a message. The message was carved onto the wall so it could not be easily removed. We are humanity. We have arrived on this planet, in this sector, for one purpose. Our one purpose was to take revenge on those that tried to take everything from us. They have failed. As we return to our home, know this: we care not for your struggles or concerns. Though let it be said, here and now, we will not become one of your struggles or concerns. Live well, strive for peace, and always be ready to defend yourself and your kin. Once done, They simply left, letting the doors open as the shouts of the Emperor receiving his penance echoed all the way down the halls. After all, he authorized the invasion of Seoul, and his son was the mastermind behind the battle plan. With that, everyone understood why it failed. Upon returning back to the colony of Mars, which was now more of a green planet than a red one, the Cybern man walked out of his shuttle to the waiting smiles and embraces of children that were no longer children. After the embrace, a young man asked if he is done. Are you done with your hate now? Smiling, the man says, Yes. Now I have only one thing to worry about from here on out. Just that other part. A young lady, the youngest of them all, simply asked, What is that? The man smiles as the younger man turns and says, Protecting what you love, of course.